What can truly break a mafia boss? Bullets, betrayal, or the woman he never stopped loving? In Cale Thornton's world, men are taught how to seize power, command fear, and survive violence. But they are never taught how to love without seeing it as weakness. So when Cale looks up and sees Meadow, the wife who disappeared 8 months ago, standing at his own engagement party pregnant and working as a server, the moment becomes more than romantic shock. It becomes the collapse of an identity built on control, silence, and domination. Because this story is not only about whether he can get her back, it is about whether a man shaped by power and blood can still become worthy of tenderness, fatherhood, and redemption.
Observe the atmosphere within the chamber as it turns glacial, a congregation of predators detecting the scent of a wounded legacy. Emily watches from the periphery, her respiration faltering as the mythic Adrian Volkov stands stripped of his armor before the masses. This is no mere social friction. It is a requiem for a reputation, and she is desperate to evaporate before the scavengers commence their feast. There exists a morbid elegance in a tragedy from which one cannot avert their gaze. Suddenly, the hunter identifies his mark. Adrian's stare pierces the surrounding chaos, anchoring her with a chilling sense of recognition. For weeks, she has witnessed his mechanical brutality, but this expression, this is something far more predatory than mere commerce. She has become the celestial center of his darkening universe. There is no warmth in those irises, only the frigid, calculated desperation of a man drowning. With a singular, unspoken decree, her autonomy dissolves, her body gravitating toward him. She clutches that synthetic clipboard to her sternum, a pathetic bulwark against the crushing gravity of 1,000 judgmental stares. Positioned at the sacred threshold, she confronts a man sculpted from frost and profound sorrow. She murmurs her name, Emily Carter, a fragile reminder that she is but a phantom in his reality. Yet he is not searching for a subordinate. He poses a question that shatters the local silence. Do you belong to another? Total solitude. No one awaits her return, and no golden band marks her hand as claimed. Her pulse thrashes against her ribs like a captive sparrow as he scrutinizes her. It is a clinical, soul-stripping evaluation, a man selecting a prosthetic tool rather than a partner amidst the debris of his existence. She is a monochromatic silhouette in a gallery of vibrant peacocks, and therein lies her utility. He inquires about the valuation of her life. When she suggests $60,000, he scoffs, countering with $5 million. The collateral? Her essence, her identity, and a covenant sworn in this very instant. The rotation of the world ceases. $5 million, sterile and untraceable, offered for the price of stepping into the inferno. It is a Mephistophelian pact proposed within the house of the divine. Adrian does not blink. He is purchasing a fabricated miracle to obscure a public catastrophe. A plain garment, 2 hollow syllables, and a lifetime of financial insulation. Is this a sophisticated farce? No. Look at his countenance. That is the expression of a sovereign watching his citadel dissolve, utilizing cold, binary logic to construct a levee against the tide of his own ruin. She wavers, seeking the exit, but his grip is an unbreakable tether. In 5 minutes, the public will witness a monarch abandoned, a king without a crown. To be perceived as a victim in his ecosystem is a terminal diagnosis. The sharks are already orbiting the altar. Faith in others is a luxury he can no longer afford. He anchors himself to that wheelchair as if it were a throne of jagged glass. The physical trauma failed to dismantle him, but the perception of frailty? That will injure him more effectively than any lead projectile ever could. A spasm of raw agony flickers across his features, and for a fleeting second, the monster appears profoundly human. It resonates with a chord deep within Emily, the girl who was always the blurred figure in the family portrait, the one who navigated life being looked through, never truly seen. She is the eternal secondary character, a phantom who constructs dreams for others while her own reality gathers dust. She returns to the suffocating silence of a vacant apartment, a woman whose total disappearance would leave the world's pulse unchanged. Now he is offering her a fortune to step into the incinerating glare of the spotlight. She attempts to caution him, her voice a trembling thread. "The world will see the fabrication," she whispers. "They will recognize that I am merely a stage prop for your ego." He possesses no appetite for romance. This is a tactical withdrawal. He requires a human shield, not a companion. He selected her precisely because she has no investment in the game, no secrets to commodify, and no ambition to sharpen a blade for his back while he slumbers. He leans closer, his voice a low, elegiac resonance. He chose her specifically for her status as a nobody. It is a surgical truth that cuts deep, but the sheer velocity of the moment numbs the agony of being identified as a blank canvas for his grand manipulation. For the first time, a man of immense power is being terrifyingly transparent with her. There are no romantic illusions here, only a massive wire transfer and a role to inhabit. 12 months of high society theater, performing affection for a man who views her solely as a strategic asset. A year of inhabiting a lie, followed by a silent departure with a fortune in her possession. He smiles, a cold, derisive gesture, reminding her that the alternative is returning to a $75 an hour existence. A life of perpetual scraping versus a year of gilded performance. He detects the starvation in her gaze. $5 million is not merely currency. It is the master key to a door she never dared to knock upon. The mass of that bribe is heavy enough to fracture her conscience, silencing the instinctual voice screaming for her to flee. For 28 years, she adhered to the social contract and inherited nothing but a collection of desolate nights. Being the virtuous girl only invited the world to tread upon her. Perhaps the hour has come to be reckless. Perhaps this danger is the very nourishment she has been craving. "I will do it," she exhales. His countenance remains a mask of unyielding granite, but the shadows in his eyes shift. He barks a command to its periphery. 3 titans who resemble ordnance more than men, standing in a state of stunned equilibrium. He calls forth a lieutenant named Marcus, a man whose hands seem engineered for the termination of lives. The directive is absolute. Procure a gown, do it immediately, and return within 10 minutes. Without a word, the enforcer and his shadows dissolve into the stone corridors of the cathedral. The floor seems to tilt as the gravity of her decision takes hold. She has mortgaged her future to a sovereign of the underworld. He commands her to discard the clipboard. She must shed the skin of a subordinate to don the crown of a consort. Her digits tremor as she allows her former life to impact the floor. He seizes her wrist, his grip a grounding, heavy mass that anchors her to this new reality. "No more employer," he intones. "For the public, we are a grand tragedy of devotion." The ghost of his contact persists on her skin as the minutes are bled away. Marcus returns, bearing a minimalist white shroud of a dress. It is a frantic, hollow preparation for a ritual that contains no spirit, only the cold, rhythmic breath of survival. The silk clings and drapes in all the wrong places, a costume for a play she never auditioned for. In the reflection, she observes a stranger with hollowed eyes. Her superior, Vivian, stands in the threshold, a silhouette of absolute judgment and profound disbelief. Vivian cautions her that she is being utilized as a pawn in a grand master's game she cannot hope to comprehend. Emily does not waver. For $5 million, she will become whatever he requires. She will descend into the lion's den if the valuation is sufficient. There is no celestial choir, no fragrance of lilies. only the oppressive silence of 200 assassins observing her descent. Every stride toward the altar feels like a final heartbeat. Adrian waits there, a portrait of absolute, terrifying equilibrium. She reaches his side, and he accepts her hand with a tranquility that freezes her blood. The clergyman begins to offer a protest, but a single glance from Adrian lobotomizes the holy man's resolve. "Proceed," he growls. The union is ratified with the surgical precision of a hostile takeover. No vows of eternity are exchanged, no murmurs of sentimental devotion, only the rapid-fire transaction of legalities in a chamber populated by ghosts. The transaction is finalized. He presents her to his kingdom with a silent ultimatum. Acknowledge this new paradigm or endure the inevitable fallout. The ensuing silence is visceral. He turns his back upon her, leaving his new consort to navigate a sea of apex predators without a compass. She is now Mrs. Volkov, a title that feels like a lead weight tethered to her soul. She follows him into the gloom, catching a brief glimpse of the fractured man residing behind the armor. The iron gates strike the frame with finality. He demands total isolation, transforming their wedding night into a period of cold, clinical internment. The fabrications are already infiltrating the city like a pathogen. No one accepts the romantic fairy tale, yet everyone is too paralyzed by fear to articulate the truth. There is no path back to the familiar. His parting words to her serve as a grim benediction. Try to remain among the living. Does this structure represent a palace or a mausoleum? The windows are comprised of reinforced glass, engineered to exclude the world and entomb the secrets within. $5 million for a few minutes of high theater. Marcus addresses her as ma'am, a title that carries the metallic aftertaste of copper in her mouth. A gilded cage featuring corridors that stretch into infinity, guiding her toward a sanctuary where the only companion is her own burgeoning regret. The metamorphosis commences this evening. Irina is arriving to burnish the new trophy and armor her for the inevitable encounter with the wolves. Silk supplants cotton, diamonds replace the pedestrian. Everything she once represented is being interred under layers of prohibitively expensive psychological armor. They inhabit separate realities beneath the same roof. A marriage established on parchment, crystallized by a distance that no amount of capital can bridge. The master does not require intimacy, they inform her. She sits in the shadows, contemplating if the fortune was a fair trade for the hollow ache expanding in her chest. $5 million, 12 months of enforced silence. That is the precise price tag for the remainder of her natural life. 1 year of performing for a gallery of monsters. All for the singular hope of a payout that might buy her soul back from the abyss. Irina assumes control. The hollow pleasantries have evaporated. The conflict for social survival begins now, and in this ecosystem there are no survivors. Dressing as survival, one either dons the mantle or meets the abyss. From a fatal slip to underworld rule, your image is your oxygen. Wrapped in night sapphire, the change ends. She has become a blade. A mask in the mirror, icy metal and stone seal the trap. The ring settles. He dictates every pulse in this waking nightmare. 200 predators fall silent as she enters the lion's den. His cold verdict, passable. Eyes watch their empty silver covenant. The order, smile and stifle your soul. Become a nameless shadow. The interrogation begins. He warns her to arm herself before the kill. Lies take root. Then comes Julia, a crimson omen of certain danger. Those sharp blessings are weapons used to dissect the new bride. She taunts her, whispering of corpses beneath their very feet. Old ghosts return. His grip whitens against the metal of his seat. She suffocates in silence while he purges his toxic, dark history. A final warning hangs. He demands a performance upon the floor. He dictates a dance, a stunning deception for the curious crowd. He pulls her close, faking a warmth that never truly existed. His frozen whisper, "Let terror sustain you until the morning light." 180 minutes bound by law among a room of killers. The show ends. He tells her to vanish into the periphery. Only a void remains as the leader retreats into his gloom, caged within golden walls for 365 long days. That $5 million gem is just a receipt for a deal. He forces distance, leaving her to haunt the hollow, echoing halls. 12 months to survive the winter of a stranger's cold house. Rumors of their secret pact reach every hungry, waiting ear. Her companion breaks. She only cares about the final bank transfer. A cold courier brings the master's summons to his private room. Life is now a calculated parade within the circles of power. Her role is a legal debt within this den of predators. Marcus guards the entrance to that grim room of dark leather. His eyes cut through her, though his soul seems entirely spent. Trivialities cease. The sovereign dictates his absolute non-negotiable laws. $50,000 monthly to fund this empty grand masquerade. Forbidden zones and lethal costs for any secret that escapes. Play your part perfectly or face the final dark curtain. Smile for the cameras. Shaming the king is a death sentence. Touching is banned. 2 lives unfolding in separate, frozen rooms. Imagine the groom building a wall with every word. She submits, masking her fear. He pushes forward legal chains. "Sign," he says. "Let our truths be buried forever within these frigid stone walls." A single word out of place means total ruin. She reads. One leaked secret erases her life. She gasps for air, seeking an exit. But the vows are already heavy. She is finally locked in. The signature was the lock turning. He takes the papers, cold and distant. "Marcus is your shadow now," he says. "Freedom ends here." She resists, but he reminds her who she is. "Is this life?" she asks. "Existing as machines?" For a second, his mask breaks, revealing the damage beneath. Then the frost returns. "My soul died years ago," he says. "This arrangement works." "Leave," he orders. She escapes before her heart confesses. He was blunt. She is just a gear in his engine. She wanders the estate, tracing the layout of a sanctuary that feels more like a grand mausoleum. 30 rooms of empty wealth, endless halls, and silent staff who move like ghosts. She is a specter in a machine that ignores her. Then she finds herself lost in a forest of ancient books. A cathedral of stories reaching upward. This wasn't for status, it was for survival. Worn spines and treasures sit in beautiful disorder. The refuge of a man who once found peace in the written word. Adrian haunts the threshold like a living ghost, his presence a heavy weight in the doorway. Emily flinches as he enters. He doesn't merely occupy space, he dominates the entire room's atmosphere from his seat. "I didn't mean to intrude," she whispers, her voice faltering. "There is no intrusion," he counters. "Legally, this estate is a shared asset, a marital monolith belonging to both of us." His words carry the serrated edge of a man long accustomed to bitterness. He retrieves a battered volume from the shelf, his fingers tracing its history. "Do you seek refuge in fiction? Only when reality becomes too suffocating? Then consider your calendar cleared." He hands her a copy of Crime and Punishment. The spine is shattered, a testament to a reader who has dissected these pages 50 times. "Why this particular tragedy?" she asks. "It is a profound study on the price of one's transgressions. It feels poetic for our situation." Adrian rotates his chair with mechanical precision. "Midday meal is served at 1 o'clock sharp. Irina will show you the way. Punctuality is required. I have no reservoir of patience for delays." He vanishes into the corridor before she can find her voice, leaving her trapped between a strange attraction and cold logic. She tries to focus on the text, but the prose dissolves into a blur of ink. Her mind becomes a repetitive loop of their isolation, a hollow union built to perform for society while they drift in separate orbits. The prospect of 12 months in this gilded cage feels like an eternity. Their first lunch is a quiet catastrophe, two strangers occupying the same table, anchored by a suffocating silence. The stillness in the room is a physical force thick enough to choke the air. "Is this our daily theatricality?" she ventures. Adrian barely acknowledges her, his focus fixed on his device. "Is what?" "This performance of silent coexistence. It's a farce." "It is a requirement," he snaps. "The household staff are the audience. Rumors thrive on distance. You will master the choreography of this role in time. And if I refuse to play along, then this year will become a slow, agonizing descent into misery." Adrian finally breaks his gaze from the screen, his eyes boring into her. "What did you envision, Emily? A romantic fable? A sudden confidant?" "I simply hoped for a trace of human decency." "Fine. We are engaging in dialogue now. Does this satisfy your need for connection? You are merely tolerating my presence. There is a vast chasm between endurance and engagement." Adrian's expression hardens into a mask of stone. "You desire engagement? Let us dissect your history. Where did you spend your formative years? What skeletons occupy your family's vault? What thoughts haunt you when you aren't playing the part?" The questions strike like a tactical strike, cold and designed to wound. He isn't seeking knowledge. He is sharpening his intellect at her expense. "Connecticut," she retorts, her tone sharp. "A standard middle-class upbringing with two sisters who actually understand reality. My family thinks I've lost my sanity by wedlock to a phantom. No grand mysteries, just a life of labor." "A desert of the soul," he remarks. Coming from a man who had to purchase a companion for his hollow fortress, that is rich. She has overstepped the boundaries. Bracing for his fury, she is surprised when Adrian erupts into a sudden, jagged laugh, a rare moment of humanity that cracks the ice. "Touché," he admits. "Two fractured souls inhabiting a ruin. At least we are finding honesty within the wreckage." "Are we? It feels more like we are both suffocating under the weight of the act." The brief warmth evaporates instantly, replaced by his usual frost. "It must be enough. There is no alternative path." He maneuvers away from the table with a sense of finality. "My schedule is full until twilight. Marcus will drive you into the city. You require a wardrobe that matches the status of a billionaire's consort. My attire is perfectly adequate. You dress like a subordinate. That ends today." He lingers at the threshold for a heartbeat. "Emily, you asked what I truly want." He avoids her gaze, staring into the middle distance. "I want to cease being a public exhibit for even a second. I want to be more than a man in a chair, defined by his limitations. But life is indifferent to our desires. I chose the path of survival." "Perhaps you should learn to do the same." He is gone before she can process the weight of his admission. She remains in that opulent vacuum, wondering if he has already surrendered. Perhaps survival is the only victory left to claim. The thought is more chilling than her wedding vows. Then begins the surreal journey with Marcus, his silent, watchful shadow. He leads her through boutiques where a single dress costs more than a year of her past life. Designers flock to her like birds of prey, draping her in the finery of the elite. Marcus remains a stoic observer, handling the black card with the indifference one might show at a grocery store. It is a cinematic transformation, but one stripped of joy and replaced with the cold weight of duty. Does he always weaponize his wealth this way? She wonders aloud. Wealth is merely an abstraction to him, Marcus replies. It is equipment. You are inhabiting a role, and he is simply providing the necessary wardrobe. My role as the trophy wife. Precisely. Marcus meets her eyes in the mirror. I have been by his side for 8 years, long before the tragedy changed everything. He projects the image of a winter king, but beneath that, Marcus pauses, carefully choosing his words. He isn't a villain. He has simply been scorched by betrayal too many times to trust the flame again. By Scarlet, by everyone. Marcus steers the car onto the long, private driveway. The world sees the power and the treasury. They never bother to see the man. You are the third person to hold a blade to his shadow, his kin, his associates, and then her. He built these fortifications for a reason. Emily lets the gravity of that statement settle. 3 deep psychological scars. It is no wonder he perceives her as a strategic liability rather than a partner. My intention isn't to dismantle him, she whispers. Are you certain of that? Marcus keeps his eyes on the road. Because every time you treat this mansion as a prison, you wound him. Every time you count down the days until the contract expires, it is a fresh cut. He is aware of the transactional nature of your union, but being reminded of it 24/7 is a slow-acting poison. That realization hits her with visceral force. She had been so preoccupied with her own indignation that she failed to see the shattered man behind the desk. He had reached out in a moment of desperation, bringing her into his private sanctuary, and she had responded like a captive on death row. She wasn't just a guest, she was actively feeding the darkness of his internal nightmare. I am lost in this landscape, she admits. I have no idea what he expects of me. Then discover it, Marcus says firmly. You sign the pact. Adrian has been discarded by enough people. Don't add your name to that list of betrayals. That night, the concept of rest is a distant dream. Only 3 days into this arrangement, and she is already failing the test. Around midnight, she gives up on the illusion of sleep. The estate is a mausoleum of cold stone and elongated shadows. She finds herself drawn to the library, seeking a mental escape. The room is dimly lit, and Adrian is there, framed against the window, like a tragic figure in a painting, a book in one hand and a glass of golden whiskey in the other. His eyes find hers, deep and unreadable in the gloom. Wrestling with the ghosts tonight? He asks. Something like that, she murmurs, standing tentatively at the door. I can depart if you prefer to be alone with your thoughts. Adrian simply motions toward the empty armchair beside him. Stay, he commands softly. So she sits, and the two of them navigate the midnight hour in a shared, fragile silence. The tension should be stifling, but in the darkness, the edges soften. Perhaps the night allows them to discard the masks they wear for the world. Marcus believes I am breaking your spirit, Emily whispers, by highlighting the temporary nature of this. Adrian's face remains a mask. The man is far too vocal. Is he wrong, though? Does the truth even matter? Adrian closes his book with a soft thud. You are a passing season, and we both understood the terms of this merger. Pretending otherwise only makes the eventual exit more painful. But Emily refuses to retreat. What if I stopped searching for the door? What if I actually lived here instead of just waiting for the timer to hit 0? Adrian asks why she would bother. Because I am tired of being a phantom, she says. And perhaps you are tired of being solitary. This union doesn't have to be a life sentence for either of us. Adrian scrutinizes her with a long, analytical gaze. What is your proposal? I have no grand strategy, she confesses. I am simply trying to exist, to be roommates instead of enemies, to discuss something other than the logistical schedule. I am anchored to this house for 1 year regardless. We might as well find a way to make the experience tolerable. Tolerable, Adrian echoes. A remarkably humble aspiration. Well, it fits our current reality, she counters. A ghost of a smile touches his lips. You are a mystery. Most would be searching for leverage or a payout, yet you ask for a shred of humanity. Perhaps friendship is too ambitious, but let us strive to be human. Adrian raises his glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Fine. We can aim for tolerable, but do not expect a transformation, Emily. I am out of practice in this area. In what area, she asks. Opening the gates. Yes, I have observed that, she says, standing up. I'm going to find some rest, thank you for the company. It is your library, too, in a legal sense, Adrian calls out as she leaves. Emily, she stops at the door. Yes? Thank you for making the attempt. Most wouldn't even try to bridge the gap. His voice drops, revealing a rare moment of vulnerability. I know this isn't the life you envisioned for yourself. Neither of us got what we wanted, she replies. But we are here. Let's make it meaningful. She slips away before he can speak, Marcus's warning still ringing in her ears. Do not be the one who fails him. Perhaps she isn't the antidote to his trauma, and maybe this entire experiment was flawed from the beginning. But she could at least be a decent human being. She could try to ensure this 1 year wasn't a total psychological catastrophe for them both. It was a modest goal, but it was far better than the alternative of mutual destruction. The following days fell into a new, quieter cadence. Emily managed the social obligations Adrian required with polished professional grace. She wore her designer armor with confidence, smiling for his associates and navigating the dangerous waters of the elite. In the public eye, they were a seamless, formidable unit, a performance so convincing it silenced every critic. Behind the closed doors of the estate, the foundation was beginning to shift. Subtle transformations took hold. Adrian began appearing for breakfast in the grand dining hall instead of hiding in his study. Emily met him there, and they exchanged fragments of conversation. Art, philosophy, the world outside. It was just noise, but it made the mansion feel like a home rather than a tomb. Eventually, he migrated to her sanctuary, their shared quietude serving as a wordless armistice between two warring solitudes. But the peace fractured when Thursday materialized, heavy with the suffocating prestige of Manhattan's aristocracy. They were bound for a venue where the very walls exhaled the scent of dynastic wealth and old-world influence. Hours dissolved into a fever dream of cosmetic refinement, orchestrated by Irina's relentless eye for perfection. Draped in silk that cost more than a modest inheritance, her reflection felt like a curated lie. At the staircase's summit, she beheld Adrian, his ruggedness discarded for a dinner suit tailored with the clinical exactitude of a master surgeon. He loomed as a sovereign of ice, an architect of his own isolation. When he complimented her elegance, she met his gaze with a serrated wit, mocking his disbelief. He dismissed the city's mediocrity as they moved toward the waiting car, questioning her resolve for the coming charade. She simply agreed to perform the role of the devoted spouse for 4 hours of high society theater. She offered a hollow chuckle, inviting him to guide her into the predator's den. The gala was a glittering ocean of vanity where vintages flowed with a price tag equivalent to a year's honest wages. Philanthropy here was merely a performance, a tax-deductible absolution for sins committed in daylight. Though she held him close, she sensed the predatory shadows pacing beneath the gilded surface. What the crowd performed as reverence was actually primitive, unvarnished dread. Voices withered into hushed static in his wake, marking him as a solitary monolith amidst a crowded wasteland. When he noted her reticence, she confessed to watching the specters of the elite. To her, every person in that room seemed petrified by the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. His features remained a sculpted fortress of indifference, citing terror as a functional tool of governance. She challenged this, suggesting that a throne built on fear is merely a more decorative cage. Their debate was interrupted by a figure cloaked in performative charm and hidden agendas, a man who claimed to have been tracking Adrian through the social labyrinth. The intruder, Vincent, attempted to drag Commerce into the ballroom, but Adrian shut him down with a low, predatory warning. Vincent's gaze dismissed her as if she were a blemish on a perfect canvas. He sneered at the idea of Adrian introducing a mere ornament into the inner sanctum of their violent world, stripping away her humanity with a single venomous glance. Adrian's rebuttal arrived in a tone vibrating with subterranean menace, declaring her an essential part of his lineage, not a casual observer. He promised that any further disrespect would dissolve their alliance into a campaign of retribution. Pale and trembling, Vincent offered a frantic apology to the new Mrs. Volkoff before vanishing into the crowd, leaving her trembling under the shield of his wrath. She let out a jagged breath, stunned by the confrontation, but he dismissed it as a utilitarian requirement of power. He reminded her that she was now bound to his name, a title that demanded a staggering psychological toll. She recoiled at the word ownership, likening his protection to being a high-value entry in a cold financial record. Noting the sudden tension in his jaw, he rejected her interpretation, steering himself toward the glass threshold in search of oxygen. They retreated to a balcony where Manhattan stretched out like a shattered looking-glass beneath the moon. He stood against the railing, his silhouette etched against a skyline that seemed to swallow the very light of the city. The stillness lingered until his stoicism finally fractured, revealing a man who lacked the vocabulary of intimacy. He admitted his language often resembled the frost, even when he intended to provide a sanctuary. His claim of possession was not a demand for control, but a vow of safety, a promise that she would never be treated as disposable while within his orbit. A dull resonance of warmth settled in her heart, but he immediately severed the moment with a sharp, defensive dismissal. He insisted his guardianship was purely strategic, a move to prevent his enemies from finding a vulnerability in his flank. She teased him for his inability to acknowledge his own humanity without masking it in the dry terminology of a corporate merger. He refused to grant her the victory of his vulnerability, retreating behind the lie of brand management. She gently pushed, arguing that emotion isn't a defect, but he snapped back with a voice like tectonic plates shifting. To him, an open heart was merely a bullseye for an assassin's blade, a lesson learned from a lifetime of betrayal. He declared his empathy interred forever, refusing to exhume it for a mere contractual union. The statement struck her with the force of a physical impact, incinerating the fragile connection they had briefly shared. They returned to being players in a cynical drama, waiting for the finale of their mutually beneficial deception. Her response was a mere whisper of acknowledgement as she re-entered the performance, She retreated into the ballroom's artificial glow, her own spirit calcifying into something cold and unreachable. The remaining hours were a montage of synthetic grins, leaving her to mourn the idiocy of trying to find warmth in a man carved from granite. She realized the futility of her mission. One cannot rescue someone who has weaponized their own isolation. The journey home was entombed in a crushing silence that weighed more than the city itself. Once inside the manor, she bolted for the stairs, seeking refuge from the oppressive gravity of his proximity. His voice halted her, sounding like a ruin of its former self. In the cavernous hallway, he offered a fragile apology, confessing his utter ignorance of how to live without hostility. He admitted that while she was attempting to construct a shared reality, his only survival instinct was to exile everyone into the freezing dark. Looking back, she saw him at the staircase's foundation, his composure dissolved by the encroaching shadows. He confessed to a profound terror that making her a priority would only ensure his total destruction when she inevitably left. He was a man held together by sheer will, terrified that one more bereavement would shatter his core entirely. He justified his cryptic defenses by claiming she deserved a man who wasn't a labyrinth of trauma. She lowered herself to his level, sitting on the stone steps to confess her own haunting fears. She spoke of the dread of becoming a mere specter in his grand estate, invisible for 365 consecutive sunrises. She painted a picture of a wealthy future inhabited by a hollowed-out spirit. They shared a mutual vision of a horror where their deception became their only truth. He reached for her, his palm a startling contrast of warmth, and uttered a single word, bearable, that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken admissions. There were no fairy tale promises, only a grim covenant to survive the coming tempest as a unit. As she returned his gesture, the oppressive air of the mansion seemed to lose its funerary chill. It wasn't affection in any traditional sense, but it represented the first stone laid in a new, albeit fragile, architecture of trust. The ice of his persona began to show hairline fractures as that one word became their shared philosophy. The household dynamic evolved as he began to invite her perspective on the mundane. He sought her opinion on matters that yielded no dividends, finding value in things far removed from the machinery of his empire. He questioned her on the aesthetics of their existence, from the warmth of the lighting to the temperature of his stone stronghold. Her presence acquired weight and validity. The mansion ceased to be a prison for her as she began to animate the empty spaces, eventually attempting to impose order on his sprawling, neglected archives. The sterile atmosphere was gradually replaced by the fragrance of lilies, eroding the clinical coldness of his museum-like halls. He remained a silent observer of this slow transformation until 14 days later. The fragile peace was annihilated by a primal scream of suffering that reverberated from the mansion's private sanctuary. She discovered him in the training room, locked in a violent struggle with the parallel bars, while his empty wheelchair loomed like a silent, sneering magistrate. When his strength inevitably failed, he struck the floor with a resonance of total despair. He remained prone, hurling vitriol at a heavens that had seemingly abandoned him. He attempted one final desperate ascent, only to be reclaimed by gravity after 3 inches of progress. She stood transfixed, unable to retreat from his suffering. When their eyes locked, his face was a landscape of exertion and a corrosive, soul-deep humiliation that no amount of wealth could mask. He demanded her absence with a roar, his fist striking the mat in a futile protest against his biology. She remained steadfast, maneuvering his chair toward him as he vented his rage. He snarled that he didn't require a spectator for his downfall, But she warned him that his reckless fury would only lead to permanent physical ruin. She positioned his mobility aid and offered a hand, but his ego remained an impenetrable barrier of glass. With a final, agonizing effort, he hoisted his frame 1 foot into the air, his limbs vibrating with a frantic, rhythmic tremor of exhaustion. He sustained the defiance for 5 seconds before the weight of his reality pulled him back down. This collapse was silent, signifying the internal disintegration of a man's spirit. As she approached, he averted his gaze, begging her not to view him as a fractured plaything of fate. After 730 days of purgatory, his lower half remained unresponsive and mute. Here was a conqueror of markets and men, now held captive by his own neurological failures. He fought a losing battle against his own weeping, a giant reduced to rubble by the betrayal of his own flesh. She ordered him to cease his eulogy for a phantom, arguing that while his past self had expired, his sovereign spirit remained. She redefined resilience, claiming it wasn't the act of rising that mattered, but the refusal to quit the arena. She locked onto his eyes, searching for the embers of the warrior beneath the grief. She admitted she couldn't fathom his physical torment, but recognized the psychic agony of living a life that felt like a costume. Joining him on the floor, she shared a raw fragment of her own history. She recounted how her mother had maintained the ritual of setting a place for her deceased father for 6 months, inviting a specter to dinner every night. She described years spent performing for an imagined father, sacrificing her identity to a memory until she finally broke the cycle. She identified the ideal version of oneself as the most vicious antagonist one could ever encounter. Her words left Adrian in a dense, introspective quietude. The weight of her history struck him with a visceral force. A father lost at 23 during a moment of supposed joy. She had been draped in a veil of mourning for a lifetime, pursuing the approval of a man who no longer existed. Their eyes met in a silent recognition of 2 souls, scarred by different wars but the same pain. He acknowledged that battling one's own history is a conflict without a victor. In a rare moment of clarity, he offered a broken apology for the darkness that had encroached upon her. His expression finally relaxed into a state of profound vulnerability as he reached for her, silently asking for her assistance to ascend once more. As she escorts him home, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of the unspoken, their skin brushes, a fleeting spark of humanity amidst the frost. He murmurs a stunned thanks, realizing that most would have vanished the moment his crown of perfection cracked. Lingering at the threshold, he poses the question that haunts the small hours. How does one enter the past? She replies that there are no miracles, only the grueling daily labor of existence. One must cease the pursuit of ghosts and plant their feet in the mud of the present. It is a slow reprogramming of the self, choosing today until the heart finally relents. Adrian admits his recovery feels like a private, perpetual purgatory. Emily offers her hand, refusing to let him battle his own biology alone. Isolation, she understands, is the predator of the wounded. When he questions her intent, she invokes their silent pact of endurance. With a flicker of playful curiosity, she asks to witness the lion in its cage. A phantom smile touches his lips as he warns of the coming indignity. Yet he finds himself welcoming her gaze. A dense silence of shared truth descends. 2 performers weary of the masquerade. He hides his shame behind a joke about the aroma of defeat, but she pierces the fog. To her, it is the scent of defiance and blood-earned grit. Perspective is the only currency that matters here. One sees a tragedy, the other sees the pulse of a living spirit. As he walks away, the rigidity in his frame finally thaws. Alone with the cold iron, Emily observes the traces of his private war. She recognizes that ravenous hunger to reclaim one's stolen agency. Later, the library smells of oak and resin as he follows her in. He remains a prisoner of regret, pained that she saw his frailty. To a man who lived as an untouchable sovereign, every exposed scar feels like a total abdication to the void. She dismisses his apologies, choosing raw honesty over a manicured deception. He calls her an anomaly, but she counters with the name Emily Volkov, shattering the silence. The air turns icy as a sharp realization vibrates through the empty space between them. She tries to hide behind the safety of legalities, but the tension betrays her. A spark of life returns to his eyes. He grants her his true name, telling her to take whatever solace she needs to survive their pact. He hands over the keys to their shared truth. Setting aside her book, she asks a lethal question. What does he truly desire from this transaction? Stripped of his gold and paper armor, he finally admits the truth. He is exhausted by haunting his own estate as an invisible, solitary ghost. He craves a witness who sees past the headlines and the perceived monster. He hungers for human connection, a break from the freezing calculations of his rank. She mocks the idea of normalcy, but promises to build him a shelter that feels, for once, like a home. The shift has begun, two spirits talking without the burden of their masks. Resting in her chair, she admits a growing fondness for this quiet world. She sees grace in a man fighting both classic literature and his own failing nerves. The human is finally surfacing. The wealth is just white noise. Adrian looks away, warning that their boundaries are dissolving into chaos. She is stirring hungers that were never in the contract. His voice trembles as he admits her mercy is breaking his defenses, making him lose track of the ending. She suggests a momentary truce with time, but he cuts the thought with clinical coldness. He warns her against the heart's mirages, labeling her warmth as simple boredom. His truth is a sharp edge. This is all a dream, and she must wake up. Standing up, she holds herself together as her world breaks. The reminder of her place is a jagged pill to swallow. Though he wavers, trying to soften the blow, she is already gone. She commits to his frozen rules, escaping to her room before her pride fails. She scolds her own heart, acknowledging his upfront honesty. She was the one who mistook a business deal for a destiny. For 72 hours, she lives as a shadow, avoiding the library. He honors the distance, a cold guardian who won't chase what he discarded. He stays silent, letting the frost thicken. By the fourth day, a sharp knock from Marcus ends her seclusion, a summons from the master. Though she wants to hide, she chooses to face the contract she signed. The time for pretense has expired. She enters his inner sanctum, bracing for a lecture. Adrian is a silhouette of industry until he finally looks up. Without hesitation, he admits his cruelty was uncalled for. When she asks for a real apology, he simply calls his admission the objective truth of his failure. Then comes the impossible, a sincere plea for grace. He regrets the bitterness in the library and for punishing her for being human. His voice breaks as he admits she is no longer a line on a ledger. She has become something far more lethal and deep than a job. In only 30 days, she has colored his gray tomb, forcing him to feel more than just emptiness. His armor of isolation is falling apart. He confesses that his long exile in the shadows made him forget the heat of being seen, not as a ghost, but as a man. He is learning the painful price of empathy. Her absence was a fear he couldn't vocalize. For to love is to hand someone the knife. She promises him safety, but the calendar haunts him. He feels the bite of his own folly, loving someone who is only passing through. Fatigue marks his face as he moves toward her. He refuses to waste the final 11 months in a prison of fear. He begs for a fresh start, something beyond basic survival. When she asks for a label, he struggles, searching for a word that sounds like peace. She suggests friendship, a connection beyond the walls of their contract. He weighs the word carefully, as if it might sting. He agrees, but only if they kill the business talk and speak of the raw, jagged parts of their souls. No more disguises, just the truth. She wants the secrets, the history in his library and the roots of his habits. He is stunned by her insight. She moves closer, declaring she is looking for the man beneath the scars of his legacy. She wants the heart, not the myth. To her, he is a maze she is driven to explore. When she asks if this breaks their rules, he says the old laws are dead. Their old strategy failed them both. A new agreement is made, partnership, honesty, and a shared dive into the dark water of their bond. Her smile draws out a rare, aching softness in his face. He invites her to see his struggle at 2 tomorrow. She agrees instantly. He warns of the coming storm of agony and failure, but she wants it. She chooses the man who bleeds over the one who fakes it. A wave of relief breaks his mask. They are now partners in wreckage, a grim connection that feels real. She accepts their brokenness with a quiet dignity. The next day, the workout is a physical hell. She watches from the dark as he is dragged through a tunnel of pain. Simple motions become impossible tasks, leaving his body shaking. He falls again and again, but the word quit isn't in his vocabulary. Through whispered curses and raw fury, he gets up. Every time he hits the floor, the order to repeat is met with a stubborn, painful return. Silence fills the car on the ride back, a heavy shroud of fatigue. Eventually, he thanks her for staying. When he asks if his weakness disgusted her, she tells a deeper truth. Her respect has grown, for while others would have shattered, he fights for every single inch. Call it what you like, but that isn't weakness. It is pure, unfiltered endurance. Adrian thinks his struggle is a defect, but she reminds him that his inner storms aren't the whole story. A faint smile lingers as their lives settle into a poetic rhythm. Therapy, breakfast, and midnight secrets. Adrian finally strips away the shadows of his youth, detailing parents who traded affection for status and discarded him when his body failed. He has spent years swimming among sharks. In the silence, Emily shares her own wounds, the invisible middle child, a ghost in her own house. He speaks of the vultures who circled his bed and the woman who sold their forever for a headline. Emily describes the cold success of her career paired with the total isolation of her personal life. As the rain falls, Adrian's voice drops. To me, you are impossible to forget. She looks for the lie, thinking it's just pity, but he shuts it down. It isn't a gift, it is a revelation. He says she's the kind of person who changes the frequency of a room. She doesn't need to shout. The moment she speaks, the rest of the world simply fades away. He identifies in her a peculiar optical gift, the ability to find grace where others see only void. She is a study in contradictions, resilient as forged metal, yet fundamentally soft. If the collective gaze failed to find her, it was a failure of their own vision, not her brilliance. Emily falters, but Adrian strips away his pretenses, confessing that his desire for a mere bearable year was a clumsy shield for a deeper craving. The original choreography of their arrangement has been reduced to ash. In the vacuum of what remains, the air thickens with the weight of unuttered confessions. Locking his gaze onto hers, he delivers a revelation more disruptive than any staged tragedy. He desires her presence. She attempts to retreat behind the safety of the 11 remaining months on their timeline, but he rejects the arithmetic of the law. His gaze is fixed on every horizon beyond the expiration of their contract. His grip on the leather chair turns his knuckles into pale marble, a physical manifestation of his internal transgression. He understands that this breach of their pact, moving from a silent collaborator to an emotional anchor, defies all logic. Yet she has become the celestial center around which his shadowed existence revolves. The prospect of her exit feels less like a departure and more like the surgical removal of a limb he only just realized was keeping him alive. Oxygen becomes a scarce commodity as Emily watches him dismantle the artifice. He is laying his internal architecture bare, abandoning the vow of isolation he once considered sacred. "This is already real to me," he admits, pleading for a future where she chooses the man beneath the wreckage rather than the ledger or the legacy. Within her chest, her heart beats with the frantic, rhythmic desperation of a caged bird seeking flight. For 42 days, she has performed the exhausting labor of maintaining distance while her spirit raced toward him. She has spent her nights petitioning the universe to transform this transient moment into something permanent. "I just don't know," she murmurs. A verbal blow Adrian accepts with stoic grace. He pivots toward the tempest outside, a sovereign forced to confront the one thing his power cannot command. He prizes her brutal honesty over the comfort of a shallow triumph. Emily navigates the quiet void of the study, placing a hand on his shoulder where the stress feels like a tensioned spring. The silence in the library is a physical presence, a thick atmosphere where she must decide to either tether her life to his or vanish back into the obscurity from which she emerged. "Grant me 180 days, she whispers into the stillness. Adrian carries the weight of his confusion like a physical burden, yet Emily offers a devastatingly lucid truth. She cannot discern if this is genuine affection or merely the addictive rush of finally being perceived. Refusing the mercy of a beautiful lie, she grips his shoulder to tether them both to the earth. It is a moment of terrifying, unvarnished human connection. She pledges a definitive resolution at the 6-month mark, a future devoid of shadows and hesitation. When Adrian questions if he is expected to simply wait, she offers him the exit of finding someone less fractured. He doesn't waver. He finds more value in her shattered, honest self than in any curated perfection. He is entirely consumed by her, indifferent to the scrutiny of the world. The hourglass is inverted now. Before retreating, Emily leans in to press a gentle kiss to his brow, leaving the formidable Adrian Volkov suspended in time. When he seeks a definition for the gesture, she shields her vulnerability with the label of friendship. Adrian is left in a state of psychological vertigo. He is fluent in the languages of war and alliance, but the concept of a friend is a dialect he has never mastered. Emily escapes before the mounting tension ignites the room. Adrian tethers her one last time with the simple "thank you," a recognition of the truth that now hangs between them. This is not the calculated maneuver of a corporate titan. It is the raw ache of a man forced to face reality. It is a fragile, unprecedented crack in his stone exterior, and she dissolves into the hall's darkness before the gravity of the moment can pull them both into the deep. Behind the safety of her door, her pulse echoes like a frantic percussion. She has bargained for half a year of clarity, but in the marrow of her bones, the judgment has already been rendered. Standing in the lightless corridor, Emily realizes the deadline is a mere aesthetic construction. She has already begun her descent, and the fall is as hauntingly beautiful as it is catastrophic. It is an undeniable axiom. She is in love with the titan that is Adrian Volkov. This moment represents either the first stroke of a masterpiece or the opening lines of a total ruin. The 6-month horizon looms over them like a darkening sky, Suddenly, the days are no longer mere digits on a calendar. They are the final rhythmic pulses of a life she is terrified to relinquish. Every shared breath and lingering glance renders their professional boundary a transparent fabrication. 90 days dissolve in a fever dream of intimacy, with Emily still performing the role of the hesitant soul, perhaps too haunted by her own ghosts to claim her joy. They are mid-morning meal when Marcus arrives, his expression a portrait of impending disaster. The sanctuary is breached. "Sir, we have a complication," Marcus states, his voice stripped of all warmth. Adrian's cup meets the table with the violence of a gunshot. The ghost of his past has materialized as a redhead with a heart of poison. Scarlet has arrived at the threshold, and she is thirsting for retribution. Emily feels the foundations of her world dissolve. Adrian's response is a low, predatory rumble as he commands her immediate removal. Scarlet is not a woman who accepts a denial of entry, and Adrian is on the precipice of calling for security. Sensing a greater conflagration on the horizon, Emily argues for a direct confrontation. Adrian's grip on his porcelain is a study in white-knuckled restraint. He knows this woman only enters a room to burn what is beautiful. Emily maintains that it is better to extinguish the flame now than to let it consume the entire structure. Adrian concedes but insists Emily remain at his side. He is intimately familiar with Scarlet's psychological warfare. She will attempt to contaminate Emily's perception with distorted histories. He demands that the truth originate from his own voice, not a malicious echo. The stage is set for a high-stakes reckoning in his inner sanctum. This is the collision point of his history and his hope. Scarlet Hayes enters the room like a siren draped in blood-red silk. She carries the entitlement of a monarch returning to a throne she never actually abdicated, her eyes appraising his sanctuary with a cold, predatory ownership. She hasn't come for reconciliation. She turns with a smile that cuts through the room like a blade catching the moon's light. Prepare for the impact. Scarlet initiates her assault with a jagged comment about Adrian's chair before redirecting her venom toward Emily. She dismisses her as a cut-rate placeholder, a mere event coordinator who has wandered into a life far beyond her station. The barbs are precise and surgically calculated. Adrian grants her exactly 300 seconds of airtime before he has her forcibly removed. Adrian asserts that she is a ghost, but Scarlet contends their union was never truly laid to rest. She locks her gaze onto Emily and reveals that the marriage was a product of pure clinical malice. Consider the psychological horror of being a weapon forged specifically to wound an ex-lover. Scarlet is here to deconstruct their reality, one jagged syllable at a time. Adrian reframes the act as a strategic maneuver, not a personal vendetta. But Scarlet is already holding the pin of a grenade. She asks Emily if she is aware of the dark machinery behind their aborted wedding, prepared to expose the beast beneath Adrian's skin. He commands her silence, but the blow is already in motion. She wants Emily to see the metaphorical shackles he allegedly employs. Scarlet constructs a narrative of tyranny. She claims that on the eve of their vows, Adrian threatened to ash her family's legacy should she ever attempt to leave. In her version of history, he demanded total dominion over her very soul. Emily turns to Adrian, the seeds of suspicion beginning to sprout in the garden of her heart. Is this the man she has allowed to see her true self? Adrian confesses to a ruthless strategy. He acknowledges the existence of severe penalties for breaching a contract with his house, but he dismisses the ownership narrative as a ghost of her own creation. His hands tremble upon his wheelchair, and Emily finds herself caught in a psychological no man's land. In a landscape of shadows, who do you trust when the truth is being used as a weapon? Scarlet continues her siege, but Adrian shifts the momentum. He reminds her she was never a victim. She was a social architect who pursued his name for its weight. The moment his accident stripped him of his perceived value, she sought to vanish. Adrian simply ensured she understood that in his world, one does not simply walk away from a covenant signed in blood. He defines himself as a pragmatist who refuses to be used as a pedestal. He demands the true objective of her visit, knowing this is no nostalgic journey. It is an extortion. Scarlet discards the performance of the grieving lover, her eyes turning cold and clinical. The mask of the siren falls, revealing the transactional heart of a shark. Scarlet wants her settlement. She demands the payout from their original pact, $2 million immediately and another $3 million to follow. Adrian's laughter is a hollow, mocking sound. He refuses to subsidize a union that never materialized, but Scarlet sneers that he owes her for the public humiliation of being discarded for a nobody. Scarlet's rage is a living thing. Her social status is in tatters, while the public offers pity to the woman replaced by a common planner. She demands a small fortune as reparations for her wounded pride. The sheer hubris is breathtaking. She genuinely believes she can put a price tag on her own departure from his life. Adrian offers her nothing but the exit. He refuses to finance her campaign of spite, but Scarlet has one final piece of leverage. She threatens to leak the truth of their fraudulent marriage to the press. If the public discovers their romance is a $5 million fabrication, Adrian's legacy will dissolve. Emily's heart skips as the ground beneath her begins to crumble. Scarlet produces the documentation, the ledger of the $5 million transfer, and the one-year expiration clause. She paints Emily as a desperate instrument used to salvage a dying reputation. She is prepared to reduce his world to ash unless her demands are met. This is no longer a dialogue. It is a clinical act of high-stakes extortion. The silence in this chamber is heavy enough to fracture bone. Emily's heart thunders against her chest while Adrian plays a calculated game of risk. He is weighing the cost of her silence against the total devastation of his life's work. Every passing second feels like a slow-motion descent into an inevitable catastrophe. Adrian's retreat is purely tactical, a calculated move in a high-stakes game. He offers $500,000, a sum beneath his notice, as a final, biting ultimatum. He mocks her as a common thief, wielding his wealth with the cold precision of a surgeon's blade. But the strategist holds a lethal counter-move, the documented sins of her bloodline. 5 years of systemic rot stand ready to bury her father within 24 hours. Trapped in his web, she accepts the $500,000, her eyes burning with a silent, impotent rage. The performance ends as Marcus initiates the wire. Adrian discards her like a spent cigarette. As she leaves, she casts a chilling prophecy. Good luck, you will need it. She departs, leaving only a trail of expensive perfume and the stench of defeat. The door latches, sealing the theater of war. Emily stands stunned by his casual payout, but for Adrian, it was merely an accounting correction. He stares into the gray horizon, a man built of secrets. One wonders what ghosts he still harbors in that hollow chest. Observe the man behind the curtain. He is playing for the highest stakes. He knows his empire is built on gloss. Yet beneath that obsidian mask, he is gripped by terror, not for his fortune, but for the safety of the woman he claims to ignore. High society views their bond as a fabrication, yet he uses that lie as a fortress. Emily suddenly realizes the weight of his sacrifice. He burned $500,000 just to insulate her from the flame. This isn't vanity. It is a soul laid bare. The patriarch attempts a show of force, claiming her as his property. But when Emily pushes back, he recoils, disguising his profound vulnerability as mere guardianship. We see the cracks in your armor, Adrian. The heart is beginning to show. She wonders if she is a person or just a line item in a ledger. The pressure finally breaks him. Adrian reveals a landscape of psychological desolation, admitting he views their union as nothing more than a brief intersection of two lonely shadows. His history is a map of scars, a skyscraper of betrayals from those who should have loved him most. He is simply marking time, counting down these 9 months as he prepares for the inevitable moment she vanishes from his life. When Emily hints at a shift in their bond, he strikes back with calculated malice. He dismisses her burgeoning feelings as mere Stockholm syndrome, mocking her as a victim of her own isolation. It is a cruel, jagged blow designed to protect her from himself. He turns her own empathy into a weapon, framing her love as a desperate survival reflex. He believes she is simply decorating the walls of her own prison. He is a master of preemptive self-destruction, burning his own joy before anyone else can. Then he delivers the final, soul-crushing insult. He claims she is only enticed by the gold and the prestige. He challenges her to name a single part of his broken spirit that she truly desires, separate from his billions. Her world turns to static. The words of defense die in her throat, strangled by the weight of his cynicism. Adrian stands before her like a hollowed-out ghost. He retreats into his cold mahogany sanctum, leaving her in the ruins. Surrounded by the silence of the library, her resolve finally fractures. His accusations have planted a seed of existential dread. Is she a woman in love, or merely a captive who has learned to adore the beauty of her gilded cage? She struggles to justify the visceral pull she feels for this man. Perhaps she did sell her soul for a billionaire's whim. The acid of self-doubt begins to erode her sense of self, leaving her hollow and questioning everything. The hours dissolve into an agonizing wait. At 10 o'clock, Marcus delivers a grim report. The master of the house is in the gym, subjecting himself to a 4-hour cycle of brutal physical self-flagellation. Marcus fears the man is pushing toward a breaking point. Emily finds him there, a fallen titan grappling with iron, forcing his body into a state of total muscular collapse. He is drowning in sweat, a physical manifestation of his internal war. He gasps out his motivation. He will not stop until a feeling of worthlessness is purged. He collapses repeatedly, trying to shed the skin of his own perceived failures. It is a haunting portrait of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The demons of his past are winning. He failed his first love, and now he is failing Emily. He is submerged in a sea of self-hatred. Emily falls to her knees, pleading with him to stop before his body permanently breaks under the strain. He believes this agony is his penance for dragging her into his fractured world. Finally, the defensive walls crumble. He confesses the terrifying truth. He is paralyzed by his own need for her. The Ice King is melting in his own heat. The mask is shattered. He admits his cruelty was a desperate attempt to save her from the wreckage of his soul. He is consumed by her presence, and that is his greatest fear, because everyone he loves eventually leaves him as if dark. He recognizes the expiration date on their contract, yet he loves her regardless. Emily calls him a beautiful fool before pulling him into a desperate, grounding kiss. This is the ignition of months of suppressed, agonizing desire. She pours every unspoken vow into that one touch. Adrian is momentarily paralyzed before surrendering to the tide. When they finally part, she tells him that the reasons for her love were simply too vast for words to contain. She loves his silent gravity, his unyielding spirit, and the way he hides his tenderness behind old paper and ink. She loves the fragile, hidden man that the world is never allowed to witness. She loves the way he instinctively stands between her and the storm. She chooses to stay, not for the salary or the status, but because their souls have become inextricably linked. 6 months was an eternity to hide such a truth. Time seems to suspend its flight. He pulls her back into a deep, meaningful kiss, finally accepting the miraculous reality that she is his partner for the long journey through the shadows. He whispers a question. Can she truly love someone so fundamentally broken? She replies that his scars are part of the beauty. For the first time, the iron-willed boss allows the tears to fall, weeping in the safety of her arms. The gym becomes a sanctuary where time has no meaning. He confesses his total illiteracy in the language of love, but she promises him a lifetime to learn how to be whole together. Adrian is now starving for her connection. She suggests they return to separate quarters to keep appearances. But the boss has no intention of spending another second in the exile of a lonely bed. He silences her doubts with a kiss that feels like the birth of a new world. It is the beginning of their true story. They finally retire, but only after Adrian has emptied his heart of every hidden fear. Emily falls asleep with a quiet soul, her phone cast aside. Nothing matters more than the realization that the formidable Adrian Volkov loves her with a terrifying absolute devotion. By daybreak, Adrian is already awake, his face transformed by a serenity she has never witnessed. He admits that sleep was a distant thought, his mind occupied by the electric memory of their night together. The resonance is mutual. They stand as equals on a new horizon. Adrian takes her hand, making a vow as unbreakable as steel. Emily laughs softly, insisting on breakfast before they face the beautiful chaos of their future. It is a delicate new beginning, but it is authentic. Adrian's rare smile is a masterpiece of relief. The moment is interrupted by Marcus, who instantly detects the shift in the atmosphere. He knows the contract has become a covenant. Adrian orders him away, but Marcus has the final word. The money is paid, and Scarlett is gone forever. He leaves with a knowing grin, having just won $50 on a bet regarding their inevitable romance. Adrian is unfazed by the gossip. He asks if she is ready for the public eye. The facade has fallen. The world will soon learn that the Volkov patriarch has surrendered his heart, and the fallout will be monumental. Emily is ready for the storm, declaring their messy reality is worth the price of admission. She kisses him with a sense of ownership. Adrian pulls her onto his lap, dismissing his desk and the world, at peace in his own kingdom. They vanish into the quiet of their connection, and Adrian speaks those 3 words again. He vows to say them until they are the only thing she hears. Emily smiles, knowing she will never tire of that melody. She echoes his devotion, flaws and all. They spend the day mapping out a future of journeys, literature, and even his grueling physical recovery, which feels like a victory now that they are a team. Adrian notes that their inner circle is already sensing the change. Emily finds a playful joy in the coming scandal. She tries to head to the office, but Adrian is a man reborn, begging for just a few more minutes of her time. He is addicted to her presence. They spend the day working with the doors wide open, sharing coffee and stolen moments of affection. It is a domestic heaven for a man who previously only understood the language of war. This is the ultimate triumph, the act of being chosen. Adrian, a man of infinite psychological layers, finally leveled his walls for her. It isn't a fairy tale, but a living, breathing testament to the power of love. 9 months remain on their legal agreement, but the document is now a relic. They are no longer performers in a scripted drama. They are partners deciphering the complex, beautiful dialect of a life shared. The road isn't always smooth. Adrian still occasionally retreats into his professional armor, but they are building a new foundation. A month later, she officially relocates to his wing of the state, making her presence permanent. He remains the perfect gentleman, ensuring she has her own sanctuary right beside his. They pass the hours in their private lounge, talking until the clock strikes 12 and falling asleep in a state of perfect shared peace. Her entire world has been transformed. Gone are the days of the sterile transaction that once linked them. As she drifts through pages of prose, the facade Adrian wears dissolves, leaving only a raw, whispered admission of the heavy burdens he carries. She readies herself for a verbal strike, yet discovers a salvation instead. Behind the scenes, a secret collaboration with James has brought the elusive prospect of independence within his grasp, sending her pulse into a frantic rhythm. It is a delicate aspiration where a full recovery remains a distant myth, yet the simple act of rising becomes their shared odyssey. Still, a spectral fear lingers in his eyes, the paralyzing dread of offering a hope that might only lead back to ruin. The memory of the man he once was continues to plague him, but she serves as the blade that severs his ties to that morning. She declares he has no obligation to resurrect his past self. If the world demands a ghost, that is its own failure. He voices the central anxiety. Does his physical state diminish her affection? Her reply is unvarnished. She chose the soul, not the posture. Whether standing or bound to his chair, he is her entire world, and he draws her into a silent, possessive embrace. He reflects on how a desperate act of recruitment became his greatest fortune. Lost in an uncharacteristic wave of emotion, he is only brought back to reality by the piercing, frantic urgency of Rachel's persistent calls. His sister-in-law threatens a confrontation at the gates, yet he remains unmoved. He welcomes the intrusion, preferring to face her vitriol directly rather than through the sterile medium of a digital screen. The prospect of him confronting her kin leaves her stunned. For him, it is merely a strategic engagement, a necessary ordeal where he intends to weaponize his charisma to dismantle their preconceived notions in a single night. He admits the irony of his position. A merchant of shadows who once bought her, only to lose his own heart in the trade. 72 hours later, the family arrives, appearing less like visitors and more like a rescue party. She finds herself caught in a web of nerves, trying to rationalize the opulence of her surroundings. Her sister's arrival is explosive, a frantic confirmation of life, while their mother seems crushed by the sheer weight of the unfolding drama. The air is thick with their resentment at her disappearance into this high-walled sanctuary. When her mother attempts to pathologize their union as a marriage of strangers, she meets the critique with an unwavering newfound strength. She ushers them into the belly of the beast, hoping to temper the rising storm. While the younger sister is quietly mesmerized by the wealth, the mother's gaze remains a cold instrument of interrogation, scanning for cracks in the gold. The questioning turns surgical as they demand to know how she could align with the lord of the underworld. Though the mother is haunted by visions of violence, she is met with the quiet truth that this fortress is the only place she has felt truly whole. A simple reassurance fails to satisfy. She meets her mother's gaze with a steel resolve, asserting that she sees beyond the danger to the map of scars he carries, a geography of every betrayal that has shaped his solitude. She explains his work as a sanctuary from the perceived failure of pain, and his retreat into literature as a balm for the heavy crown he wears. He fears love because he anticipates abandonment, yet he treasures her for her essence, not her utility. A heavy silence passes between the two observers until the sister finally acknowledges the undeniable pulse of genuine affection. 4 months is a blink in time, a vertical ascent into a devotion that they struggle to comprehend. They worry she has been swallowed by his complexity, perhaps a victim of a sophisticated psychological game. She denies the manipulation, but as the pressure mounts, she realizes the time for half-truths has ended. The foundation must be revealed. The revelation drops like a lead weight. $5 million to play the role of a wife for 365 days. The room goes cold as the sister's shock turns to pity, and the mother laments the perceived sale of a soul. They frame it as a transaction with a predator, but she views it as a contract that unexpectedly birthed a sanctuary. She rejects the label of a ghost, the unwanted daughter, asserting that this agreement gave her the visibility she never had. What began as a ledger entry evolved into a profound connection, a transformation for which she refuses to apologize. Her sister counters with the harsh reality of being a paid instrument in a house of shadows, a critique she cannot ignore. She turns the mirror back on them, questioning the morality of a sanctioned marriage for financial security versus her own calculated survival. The strike lands true, exposing the thin line between their social conventions and her own radical choice. They dismiss it as a convenient myth, predicting a collapse once the legal ties dissolve. Yet she remains firm. The ink on the contract is irrelevant when the commitment has already transcended the page, regardless of the skepticism surrounding them. She defends her trust as something earned through daily acts of transparency and vulnerability. But her sister remains unconvinced, arguing that men of his caliber do not find redemption. They simply refine the art of concealment. She suggests that her sibling is only witnessing a curated performance, a mask designed to deceive. Before the argument can escalate, his voice enters the room, sharp and decisive, cutting through the domestic tension. He enters not with a denial, but with a chilling affirmation of her fears. He admits to the wreckage left in his wake, the broken lives that served as the foundation for his empire, refusing to hide the blood on his hands. Addressing the sister, he confesses his struggle to become a man worthy of the grace he has been shown. He acknowledges the possibility of failure, but insists that the pursuit of a better self is driven entirely by the woman standing beside him. Challenged to reveal a truth that would truly inspire terror, he looks to his partner for silent consent before recounting a dark chapter from 6 years ago. He speaks of a betrayal and the absolute, calculated destruction that followed. He describes the systematic erasure of a former associate, not just a physical breaking, but the total dissolution of the man's identity and future. It was a demonstration of power executed with a surgical lack of empathy. The aftermath was a self-inflicted tragedy for the victim, a consequence for which he felt no guilt at the time. He admits that this capacity for coldness is his fundamental nature, leaving the room gripped by a sudden, icy stillness. A profound ache settles within her, yet the revelation brings no shock, only a sobering clarity. The mother decries the madness of his world, while he simply accepts the title of a villain, laboring toward a difficult transformation. When asked how she can tolerate such a history, she admits to a profound revulsion for the violence. She does not defend his past. She merely recognizes the heavy, solitary path of a man trying to unlearn the only language he knows. She stakes her belief on the possibility of a redirected power, a metamorphosis fueled by the accountability of love. She chooses to stand by his side, acknowledging the darkness of his history while anchoring herself to his potential. Her family rejects the choice as a dangerous delusion, refusing to witness what they perceive as a life squandered on a merchant of ruin. The mother demands an exit, unable to reconcile her daughter's happiness with the man's violent legacy. She challenges him to release her if he truly loves her, to let her find a life of conventional safety. He concedes that she deserves a far better man, yet his own selfishness demands she stay, as she is the only light he has. A final, whispered warning about the fragility of the spirit hangs in the air as they depart. The following silence is immense, broken only by his characteristic dry observation on the day's theatrics, masking the weight of the encounter. As the evening settles, he admits that the time for pretenses has passed. He will offer her nothing but the jagged, uncomfortable truth of who he is. He checks on her state of mind, sensing the internal storm the day has left behind. She acknowledges the validity of her mother's plea for a simpler existence, yet she rejects it. To her, a life of guaranteed safety is a life without substance, and she finds his complexity more compelling than any quiet, hollow peace. They accept their shared insanity, a pair of outliers finding home in one another. He views her as a source of purity he doesn't deserve, but she sees only a soul worth the struggle, sealed with a kiss that carries the weight of a desperate vow. He offers a final grim prophecy of future shadows and moments of doubt, yet she meets it with the resilience of a stubborn heart. Together, they resolve to navigate the ruins of their lives, one deliberate day at a time. There is a dark irony in her role as the optimist in a den of thieves, a tragic comedy she has fully embraced. He answers with a rare, genuine moment of levity, his laughter acknowledging the beautiful absurdity of the life they've built. They linger in that liminal space between dusk and the dinner bell, a singular silhouette against the world. Yet 90 days hence, the skeletons in their closet would rattle. The media feast begins with a leaked ledger, a $5 million transaction, a counterfeit union, and an orchestrated deception. Morning coffee is served with a side of digital apocalypse, a tabloid expose armed with enough evidence to submerge them both. Emily watches their shared reality splinter under the weight of the headlines. Adrian remains a study in frozen fury, his demeanor turning chillingly precise and dangerously still. He recognizes the serpent's sting in every syllable. Only Scarlet could frame him as a merchant of flesh. Adrian realizes he left his flank unguarded against a viper. He calls for Marcus, his intellect already weaving a protective shroud to shield his dynasty from the encroaching flames. Marcus arrives prepared for a judicial crusade, but Adrian understands the futility of litigation. A lawsuit merely provides fresh carrion for the vultures. They choose instead to walk into the glare, seizing the script before the internet can finish devouring their piece. The gambit is as perilous as it is plain. Absolute honesty. They will acknowledge the fiscal foundation of their union while testifying to the genuine affection that bloomed from it. Emily refuses to retreat, opting to remain the unmoving center of the cyclone, despite the viral lies. Adrian cautions that the public will reduce her to a trope, either a casualty or a mercenary of greed. Emily is indifferent to the taxonomy of strangers. She is prepared to unspool the authentic chronicle. That afternoon, they step toward the blinding flash of public scrutiny. Marcus assembles the city's most voracious journalists. Emily is a vision of stoicism in navy silk, while Adrian exudes the frigid authority of a man with zero remaining vulnerabilities. As the cameras erupt like a firing squad, Adrian's voice descends, a low, melodic baritone that anchors the room. He admits to the clinical nature of their start, a cold purchase to fill a vacant role. It was a utilitarian move, devoid of sentiment. Yet, as his gaze finds Emily, the atmosphere undergoes a tectonic shift. She accepts the torch, her composure unwavering as she describes their internal metamorphosis. She offers them the raw truth. Affection grew from the ruins of their arrangement. The performance ends, replaced by the messy reality of two souls colliding. Though the press reacts with the fever of cynicism, Emily remains glacial, dismantling their inquiries with the poise of a queen. She doesn't contest the capital or the 12-month term. Instead, she addresses the lens directly, explaining that she remained because he truly recognized her essence. He valued her beyond the mandates of any contract, and she would embrace this public turbulence over a sterile deception. Adrian validates her testimony, conceding his lack of moral purity in the boardroom, yet naming her as his solitary salvation. He informs the world that their connection is impenetrable. The subtext is clear: anyone attempting to dismantle them must first survive a confrontation with him. As the lights dim, Emily finally breathes. The online landscape has become a theater of judgment and conflicting narratives. Her device is now a necropolis of notifications from ghosts of her past, each one hoping to scavenge a piece of her newfound agonizing notoriety. She mutes the global roar, listening only to Rachel, who describes her as a sublime brand of mad. Within the manor's walls, Adrian acknowledges the bullseye they've painted on their own backs. Truth demands a staggering premium, and they have just surrendered the full amount. Their solidarity is a defiant gesture against those who plotted their ruin. By weaponizing their own secrets, they've disarmed Scarlet entirely. Adrian offers a tender kiss, pledging that without the weight of hidden truths, they are finally liberated to simply exist. The ensuing weeks are a grueling march through public derision and tabloid stalking. Competitors attempt to convert their infamy into a corporate weapon. They weather the storm behind the estate gates, waiting for the fickle public to find a fresh carcass to devour and the whispers to fade. 6 months pass before the most poignant chapter begins. Adrian stands in the rehabilitation suite, his brow damp with the effort of the impossible. After 730 days anchored to a chair, the dethroned Titan attempts to reclaim the earth with his own strength. Emily observes, her reading abandoned as the air in the room becomes heavy. James provides the cue. Adrian clenches the parallel bars, his hands turning ghostly white as he grapples with the dread of failure. James urges him to bypass his intellect and lean into the resilience he has built. With a visceral surge of will, he hauls himself toward the sky. It is a brutal war against his own biology, but then he is vertical. His foundation remains firm. He lets out a sound, a jarring blend of weeping and triumph, the acoustic signature of a man resurrecting his own spirit. He endures for a mere 10 seconds before the gravity returns. Yet his face is radiant. His voice falters as he asks if she witnessed his ascent. Emily is already a prisoner of her own tears, whispering that those few heartbeats were the most exquisite vision she had ever seen. Following that epiphany, his progress accelerates like a storm. Seconds evolve into minutes and minutes into autonomy. Within 90 days, he traverses the room, 11 unassisted steps. It is the living manifestation of the idea that even the most fractured things can rise again. During the journey home, Emily confesses the depth of her admiration. He attempts to minimize the act as simple locomotion, but she insists he has exorcised the specter of his tragedy. He is a man who forged himself from the cinders, and that is his true inheritance. Adrian's resolve melts, admitting that he would have remained in the abyss without her light. She was the sole justification for the agony of healing. That night, he declares the end of their separate spheres, inviting her to finally inhabit his master suite and truly stay. 547 days was an eternity to wait. He desires her presence at the first light and the final shadow. No more artificial borders or performance. He wants their existences to be so profoundly interwoven that they become a single, inseparable entity. Emily assents without a moment's hesitation. Her entire history is reduced to a few crates of literature and a solitary portrait of her father. She prepares to occupy the space that has finally transformed into the sanctuary she never dared to imagine finding. His chambers are a monolith of shadow and masculine authority, yet she begins to dissolve the sharp edges instantly. She recalibrates his environment to reflect her presence, and Adrian simply observes, his features reflecting a profound serenity as she claims his sanctuary as her own. He playfully inquires if he still possesses sovereignty over his own domain. She informs him quite candidly that his penchant for order is a catastrophe. He attempts to summon the persona of the intimidating executive, but she merely laughs, noting he can't even locate his spectacles without her guidance. He draws her into his embrace, murmuring that she is the lens through which he views the world. It is his quiet way of confirming she is his gravity. He requests a vow of permanence, and she seals the promise with a kiss of absolute mutual surrender. They inhabit the quiet perfection of shared meals and forgotten cinema, the mundane existence she once only dreamed of. At midnight, he speaks those 3 transformative words. She smiles, confessing she has heard them echoing in his pulse for a long time. He finds a peculiar solace in her verbal confirmation. She pledges 5 decades of those same words, a ritual for every dawn. Adrian is stunned by the magnitude of her commitment, telling her she can map their entire future, for he is anchored to her side forever. The Titan maintains his stoic facade, claiming her departure would be merely a logistical inconvenience, a romantic soul camouflaged by clinical logic. 1 year later, on their anniversary, he finds himself mesmerized, as if she were an enigma he still cannot explain. He offers her the ultimate symbol of autonomy, the contract shredded. She is legally unburdened, yet she isn't seeking a path away from him. She mutes his talk of old obligations with a kiss, electing to choose him all over again of her own free will. With the legalistic artifice dead, Adrian demands a genuine ceremony. No criminal pageantry or political alliances, just their intimate circle and a promise of substance. He is prioritizing her over his empire, and the gravity of that choice brings tears to his eyes. He confesses that his formidable persona was merely armor against the world. Now he poses the true question: will she endure the coming tempests by his side? Her affirmative comes before he can even finish, as she finally steps into their shared forever. 8 weeks later, the garden becomes a sanctuary for a quiet union. Only their closest circle remains. The shadows of their history have receded, leaving Emily in a gown that finally symbolizes her own narrative, belonging only to her. He stands at the altar, braced against his cane. Though his body vibrates with the strain, he remains upright for his light. A brief, crystalline moment of honesty follows, and for a second, the entire world holds its breath. The performance has concluded. The masks have been discarded. They are merely 2 souls who navigated the debris together. When the vows are articulated, her voice is a pillar of strength. They are entwined once more, but this time the bond is visceral. The atmosphere feels cleansed tonight. Even the skeptics can witness the sincerity radiating from his eyes. He has shed the skin of the predator, emerging as a man restored, exchanging his iron grip for a hand that only knows devotion. It is undeniable now. She is the very air that sustains him. This is a metamorphosis forged in the furnace of crisis. Emily takes her place beside her sovereign, realizing that every peril she ignored led her to this hard-won sanctuary. Fatigue begins to claim him, yet his gallantry remains absolute as he presses a kiss to her hand. He whispers his thanks, humbled that she managed to perceive the humanity beneath the beast when he was at his most broken. He murmurs of his unworthiness of such mercy, but her heart refuses to entertain his doubt. As the nocturnal chill descends upon the garden, he requests one final dance, even as his physical reserves are nearly spent. Their movement is a syncopated, halting melody where her strength becomes his singular support. Beneath the lunar glow, the external chaos dissolves, leaving only the quiet architecture of a sanctuary they built for 2. He offers repetitive vows of eternal loyalty, seeking to validate her initial leap of faith. Yet she finds his penance already etched into his flesh. Every jagged scar serves as a silent, indelible testament to his transformation. A mere structure finally transmutes into a hearth. As dawn breaks, a gaze of reverence accompanies a simple salutation that redefines her identity. "Good morning, Mrs. Volkov." It is a profound, quintessential conclusion to their odyssey. They retreat into the poetry of the ordinary. Visualize a former architect of darkness navigating a sunlit garden with a cane, finding a strange, quiet holiness in the mundane. It is a subversion of his violent legacy. Within the hushed rhythm of shared meals and literature, Emily secures an impossible tranquility. The woman once tasked with choreographing others' unions has become the most vital cornerstone of the entire Volkov dynasty. She finds irony in the desperation of their origin story. He, however, retreats into a pensive silence, haunted by the razor-thin margin between their shared life and a timeline where they remain strangers forever. He frames this piece as his ultimate conquest. The brutality of their genesis pales against the gentleness of their resolution. She drifts into slumber, tethered to the world by the steady, rhythmic percussion of his chest. This shattered, exquisite connection justified every sacrifice. We see that love is not a singular moment of selection, but a continuous, deliberate act of will maintained through both the howling storm and the heavy silence. Their commitment is a perpetual motion machine. This is no sanitized fable. It is a kingdom forged from the raw iron of survival. The Titan and his sovereign. The narrative circle is finally complete.